Welcome, and thank you for coming. We really are looking forward to this discussion today on this warm spring day. Oh no, it's still February. I am told that unfortunately the air conditioning at Brookings isn't working, so the room is a little warm, but there's nothing we can do about it. So just deal with it. My name is Tamar Manuel Yanatinch. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for Universal Education at Brookings, and it's my pleasure to moderate the discussion today. We will be presenting the results of collaborative research between the Center for Universal Education and AidData today. As you probably know, the Center for Universal Education does research on global education with a focus on enhancing quality and equity, often in collaboration with partners, including in the developing world. AidData is a research lab at William & Mary, and it helps produce evidence to improve how sustainable development investments are targeted, monitored, and evaluated. It works across sectors and disciplines and targets both the policy and academic communities. So the two organizations have really a lot in common, and we're delighted to have been able to collaborate on this project. So the topic at hand is towards data-driven education systems. What information do education leaders want and need? Those of us who are interested in policy-oriented research have always had a keen interest in terms like data-driven systems, evidence-informed policies. So today we want to see how much of that driving and how much of that informing is really taking place, and what might get in the way and how we might be able to do better as a global community. For the center, this work builds on the work that we have been doing on information and accountability in the education sector, and for AidData on their work, on their ongoing research to understand and influence leaders in low and middle income countries. So what we're going to do is take about 20 minutes to present the findings of our recent report. And then we're going to have a moderated discussion for the remainder of the time, and we'll wrap up by noon today. So let me go ahead and introduce the speakers today, the two people who were going to be presenting the findings from the report, the two excellent, wonderful people. So the first one, and I'll do this in order of their speaking, Beth King. Elizabeth King, a wonderful friend and colleague of mine for many years, is a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for Universal Education here at Brookings. Prior to that, she worked at the World Bank for many years. She held many positions there, straddling research and policy. And in her last role, she was the director for education. And in 2010, she led the development of the World Bank Group's education sector strategy, which I think was really seminal, and many of its findings and strategies still remain relevant and have been echoed in the most recent World Development Report. She was also the World Bank's research manager for human development issues for many years. She has published on topics such as household investments in human capital, the linkages between education, poverty, and economic development. She's a keen proponent on gender equity and was one of the pioneers in looking at issues of gender in development and on education finance and the impact of decentralization reforms. Our second speaker is Samantha Custer from AidData. Samantha is the Director of Policy Analysis for AidData. She leads the group's work to assess development investments and results and generate new evidence on the use and impact of open data, and helps field surveys to learn from the experience of decision makers in low and middle income countries regarding the impact of external money and ideas in domestic policy reforms. So May I please invite Beth and Samantha to come up? So I think you're going to be taking turns at the podium, and then we're going to have 2 mics when we come to the Q&A session. Okay?
So is someone doing the
I
slides?
think you can probably do that yourself.
Okay, oh, there it is. Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. First of all, before I say anything about the report, I'd like to thank the 4 people who gave us comments on a very early draft of the report. And their comments have really been very, very useful to us. That was sometime before, I guess, Thanksgiving. So Shada Badi was one of them. Eric Swanson, her colleague and a former colleague of mine as well. I don't see Eric here. Hussein Abdul Hamid, who has been working a lot on improving the education and management information systems in many countries, and Albert Motivans, who used to be a director at the UNESCO Institute of Statistics and has since moved to the Washington, D.C. area for Plan International. That's it. He'll kill me. He's not here, but he said that he'll try to come to towards the end because he's in a conference too. So Tamar was saying how essentially the education community has really invested a lot in data. This is sort of something that all of us are talking a lot about. And I think that we can probably pinpoint that to, well, the broader development discourse about the Sustainable Development Goal. I mean, most recently. I think because of that, we all want to know, well, are we going to get to where we want to get by 2030? And the education, that was across sectors. The education community has been part of the discourse, and many actors in the education sector have been investing in what we are calling the education data revolution. So what we have here is some numbers to confirm this point that we've been investing more in data. I think the progress with measuring learning is a huge difference from the 90s or from the 2000s with respect to education data. Really measuring whether children learn, both in terms of these using standardized student assessments by PISA and by TIMSS, and you can see from this slide how many more countries have adopted these kinds of instruments. But also even in terms of measuring learning at a more micro level. So it's not just the countries using comparable student assessments, but also household surveys doing this, also impact evaluations measuring how much children actually know in terms of basic skills. We see here also the huge increase in impact evaluations, threefold since 2005. And then the last point here is that the World Bank has been investing with many countries in 200 projects to improve the EMIS in a total of 89 countries. I think this reflects, in fact, the demand of the countries themselves for data that they themselves would produce. So that was now 89 countries by 2013. But really the value of information, and that's what our report really, it's a big, big message of our report. It's not just the generation of data that we want to emphasize. We're not here just to produce data that's not used. So if you want data to have an impact, data has to be used. So here's just a simple framework about data generation, from data generation to use and impact. And what we want to emphasize in this conceptual framework is that at the middle of this, at the very center of the discourse about data generation, use, and impact, has to be an understanding of the institutional context that promotes not just generation, but also promotes use, promotes better understanding, and eventually promotes impact. So there are four that we identify here. One is to recognize that the people who have decision-making responsibilities are most likely the people who are going to be using. And we want to understand the feedback between the roles that they have and also their decision-making capabilities. We want to emphasize that power relationships within education systems is very important. And in the work that I've done in many countries, the IMES unit tend to reside in, let's say, the basement of education ministries with very little power, in a way, to affect operations. It's a unit that tends to sit kind of behind the minister, but really maybe in the sort of basement, who gives, and they would give, data to feed data to the minister, but really without much power with respect to, how they would disseminate the data, how they would affect the people who are going to use the data. So I think power relationships, especially between the data generators and the policymakers, is something very important. Part of this institution is you, the people who are in think tanks, the people who are in multinational and bilateral agencies. And I think we have to be aware of the kind of power relationships we have with policymakers, with the thinkers in the countries. And we shouldn't underestimate the importance of data culture. Is there, in fact, a culture that values information, that values evidence, that values truth, right? If there's no value given to evidence, it's not likely that it's going to be used or going to be used for affecting policy. And lastly, we shouldn't also underestimate the importance of the capacity in the ministry, in the country itself, to use the data. I think for researchers, we tend to use probably more and more powerful tools of analysis, partly because with the computer technologies improving, it's easier to actually use more powerful analytical tools. But if we want the evidence that we produce to be used by the policymakers, we have to make sure that they're able to interpret the evidence and understand how the evidence might be used for action. That's the kind of connection that I think we tend to underestimate, we tend to ignore. We think that if we produce data, data will be used. In fact, as researchers, as people in operations also, we know that that's not the case. So if we want to have impact, if we want data to have impact, this institutional context is very important. It's not only, our challenge is not only about producing data that can easily be accessed or simple and so forth. It's also who should be using the data, who will use the data, and whether those people actually have the capacity and the incentive to use the data. And that's really I would say, the key message from this report. So do we have evidence that data are being used? And this was one of the biggest challenges of writing this report, actually, is really trying to trace how much of the data that are being produced, the different types of data that are being produced, are actually used for specific things. That's actually quite difficult in terms of some of the data. All right? So for example, learning assessments, it's a little bit easier. First of all, the media, the mass media helps because, for instance, we can trace with the publication of the last PISA results, we can trace the kinds of discourse that has happened in Europe, in the US even, and in some of the developing countries. Can we trace actually how those results, how they have changed the way policymakers allocate resources to schools? Can we trace how those policymakers deploy teachers or change the way teachers are trained? Maybe for a few, but for the most part, it's very difficult to do that. And here we show what we've found from the various pieces of publications that we've been able to locate. So in some cases, these learning assessments have changed curriculum reform. That was actually one of the easiest ones because UNESCO data have actually, some UNESCO documents have actually specified that curriculum reform has been changed because of some student assessment. So that's the easier ones. But for example, deployment of teachers or teacher compensation, very difficult. So this is one of the challenges really of trying to assess whether data are being used. There's been an increase, as I said, in program evaluation and other research, and there was a systematic review done by the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, or 3IE, 2 years ago, which identified some 900. At the end of a very large review, search, they identified around 900 pieces of research that actually had credible counterfactuals. And then again, how have these impact evaluations affected action or policy? And that's also been difficult to trace. And in fact, 3IE has spent some effort to try to do that. So what you see here on in this table, what was the distribution of the uses of program evaluation? So about a quarter was about informing the discussion of policies and programs. Also about a quarter has to do with informing the design of programs. And then lastly, the education management information systems. Again, this is affecting not just the effectiveness of specific programs or projects, but really improving the ability of a whole education system to collect, to manage, to disseminate information. And so that's the EMIS. And what we see here are some of the ways by which better EMIS systems have improved investments and policy. So what we see here are mixed evidence of use. Overall investments in data generation are outstripping their use, aside from some of the examples here and there. So I would say this is one of the biggest challenges for us in the community, and we need to understand what are the hurdles to the use of data and evidence, and how can we overcome those hurdles. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Beth. I'm a little bit taller than you, so I need to adjust this. As Beth rightly mentioned, at the end of the day, it's not about the production of this data that really matters. Where the rubber meets the road is in the capacity and the incentives of leaders on the ground in education ministries and elsewhere to put this to good use. And in this study, rather than looking at data use in the abstract or from the expert's lens, we actually wanted to go straight to the source. And with that in mind, we used 2 large-scale surveys of policymakers in over 126 low- and middle-income countries. And in these surveys, we asked leaders directly about the types of decisions they make in the education sector, the role that information plays, among other factors in that process. And so our hope is that armed with these insights, we can then begin to pinpoint areas of opportunity for producers and funders of data to close gaps in response to demand and actually to increase their impact moving forward. Before I dive into the findings, let me briefly provide some context for these two surveys. So first, for our Listening to Leaders survey, 3,500 leaders from 126 countries, 5 stakeholder groups answered questions about the types of data they use and why, and from what sources. And these include leaders both in education and 21 other different domains. AidData and the Brookings Institution then teamed up to field a 2017 education data snap poll to go a little bit deeper. And we wanted to understand the ecosystem for data and decision-making in the education sector specifically. And 180 education leaders responded, sharing their insights on the types of data they use, what data they need, and most importantly, what they wish funders and producers of data would do differently in the future to better support their work. So with that bit of context in mind, I'd like to turn to what leaders have to say about the role of data in the decisions that they routinely make. It's important to recognize that the types of decisions that we're looking at here are decisions around enacting education policies, modifying programs, or allocating resources. And in that process, decision makers are making cost-benefit trade-offs, looking at the options before them. And, from the outside, it's also important to say that there are many factors in play in these decisions, and data is only one of them. In the Education Snap poll, we asked policymakers and practitioners to identify the most important factor in making or influencing common education decisions. I've broken down the results in this figure. I'll just highlight 2 things. So first, survey participants identified sufficient government capacity to implement changes as the most decisive factor in the education sector when it came to the majority of the decisions they make. And this really resonates with past research and practice that shows how frequently political considerations stymie education reforms, even when there's clear evidence outlining that this is the right course of action. Second, it's important to also say that information is never the hero, but it does play an important supporting role, particularly when it comes to how leaders allocate scarce resources and accelerate development. So an example of this, if you look at all decision types, leaders seem to place a higher premium on data when it comes to decisions such as creating or abolishing schools or grades, as well as testing, assessing, or credentialing teachers. And one possible intuitive explanation for this is that these are highly politicized decisions when you're talking about closing a school or compensating teachers. And so it's possible that, facing teachers and parents that may strongly disagree with your choice, it's important to have a strong evidence base to rely upon. Information may not be the decisive factor, as we said, but it's still one of those variables that decision makers do consider. And so we wanted to look at what types of purposes or functions did decision makers particularly use data to do. I'll say as a point of comparison that in other sectors we've previously seen that leaders use evidence more to conduct retrospective assessments of past performance, but interestingly in the education sector it's different. They're increasingly more likely to use data and evidence to look at forward planning decisions than their peers in other sectors. What types of data do they use? So we asked leaders to report on which types of data from both domestic and international organizations that they use in their work. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of things here. So first is that calls from the World Bank, the OECD, Paris 21, and others to strengthen national statistical systems appears to be well-founded. Nearly 90% of education leaders reportedly use national statistics in the education sector. That makes this the single most important source of information produced by domestic organizations overall. Notably, education decision makers rely more heavily on national statistics than even their peers in the health and governance sectors. And the outsized importance of national statistics in the education sector may tell us something a little bit about the sector's reliance on routine administrative data, such as enrollments and school infrastructure available through the country's education management information systems that Beth talked about previously. Second, I'll say for proponents of rigorous evaluations and evaluation data in the audience, you'll be cheered to know that international development agencies are not the only ones that use this information. Over 68% of leaders reported using program or project evaluation data produced by international organizations, and that amount for domestically produced evaluation data isn't that much lower. So what type of data do they need? Kind of contrasting from current use to future need. So going deeper with the Education Snap poll, we asked leaders about which types of data they viewed as most essential to their work, the types of decisions that they focused on. And we also asked them what they wished was more readily available from what they currently had. And here is an interesting kind of a set of market opportunities that we can look at. So essentially, when leaders view a type of data as both essential and as something that they want more of, this is a market opportunity for data producers to really invest in areas that there's a revealed demand to do. And we identify 4 of these unmet needs: program performance and evaluation data, national budget and expenditure data, student-level assessment data, and teacher performance data. And I'll just briefly say that the desire for more performance and evaluation data is particularly striking in light of what Beth was saying about the uptick in investments in evaluations over the last 2 decades. And as we reflected on what this actually meant in practice, we thought that this unmet need might be partly explained by gaps in geographic coverage for available studies, as well as problems that leaders face in trying to access evaluation data that's hidden behind paywalls and firewalls. I'll also briefly say that silos and fragmentation is another probable common theme across the other data investment opportunities. And it's striking that host government officials were the ones that said they most wanted more access to administrative data. Well, who collects administrative data? It's the government, right? But it just goes to show that these departmental silos actually makes it difficult for people that conceivably should have more access, and just imagine how much more difficult it is for civil society, private sector leaders, and others. What type of data do they want at the end of the day? We asked decision makers to highlight the 3 most important improvements that producers could undertake to improve their data, and I'll just highlight a couple of emerging trends. So decision makers want more timely, accessible, and disaggregated data. This is interesting because despite broader transparency commitments in many countries, much of this government data is still proprietary or hidden behind paywalls. Survey respondents in particular wanted data from the national government to be accessible and disaggregated because this is a high area of use for them. And I think that the dual emphasis on accessibility of more granular data may indicate another untapped opportunity. While we see that subnational data use lags behind national level data, this may reflect more just lack of access than lack of interest. I'll also say that over half of education leaders want data producers to tackle issues of credibility head-on, and this includes both technical accuracy and political trustworthiness. So technical constraints abound: publication delays, episodic data collection, limited data management capacity, particularly at the school level where most of that point of service delivery information is collected. And then finally, we also recognize that political factors are in play. There's a lot of perverse incentives for officials to massage or manipulate the numbers. At the end of the day, we also went to a little bit more of a specific concrete set of recommendations that leaders could choose from. As you can see, they liked a lot of these potential solutions, but the thing that came out most strongly is really doubling down on investing in those national education data systems, particularly the EMIS that Beth talked about previously. Okay, so for the sake of time, I'm going to wrap this up into a bow for you, but this is just scratching the surface, and I hope in your questions and in the panel discussion we'll push even further than this. But at the end of the day, there's 3 things that kind of come out to me as potential concrete recommendations. So first, we've invested a lot in data. We have to make sure that the data that's out there is fit for purpose. Otherwise, it's going into a data graveyard. And so you can do this by increasing access, timeliness, disaggregation, and credibility of that data that already exists. Second, there's new market opportunities. So I would suggest increasing investment and access to new program evaluation data to tap into this unmet need. And then finally, national statistics strengthening is not going out of vogue. There's much work to be done. And if you think about, at the end of the day, the single most important source being national statistics, and that people want more of it and they want to trust it more, prioritizing investments in technical support to strengthen countries' EMISs is one of the most important things that we can do. So thank you so much for your time, for your support, and for your interesting questions. I'll just briefly also thank Tamar for hosting us, Beth as a fellow co-author, and Lindsay and Tanya, who aren't up here but did a lot of work behind the scenes to make this possible. So thank you so much. Okay, so Tamar says that we can open up the floor to questions, reactions, things you feel like resonated with you, things that you want to question or push us on. Tamar, how much time do we have for questions? Looks like about 30 minutes or 20, 30 minutes? Okay. All right, so why don't we start with the young woman up here? Yes.
Okay, I was just going to talk loud, but I guess that won't work. I had a question, given one of your final slides on what policymakers want and decision makers in education. What was meant by the desire for more accurate data? I guess I'm confused as to what that is. Are they wanting the data collection instruments to be designed for other purposes? Are they confused in terminology? Is it how they're analyzed? If you could clarify that, that'd be appreciative.
Yeah. Why don't we take a few more, and then we can, gentleman over here.
Hi, I also want to thank you for the presentation. My name is Ignacio Peso. I have two questions. The first one is, if you can maybe tell us a little bit more about the difference between, you mentioned that your sample was mid-income and I think low-income countries. If there are some differences that you found between those categories. And the second is, you mentioned that in your last slide about improving making the enabling environment for data use. And yeah, like a way of seeing that is how you create demand for data. I guess if you ask a public official if he needs more data, he will probably say yes. But how you actually know he's going to use it, and how you create maybe incentives within his organizational structure for him to use those data. Like, for example, when you talk about budgeting, sometimes there's a linking between results and budget. No? Have you explored some of the ideas of how to increase the demand for the data? Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, a hand back here. Yes.
Hi, Dipti Raja with the World Bank. Thank you so much for both of these presentations. And I wanted to know more about your insights into the conundrum that you mentioned, where it's essentially government actors that are saying that they need more data, but they're the ones collecting the national level data. And I was wondering if you had some more insights to share on what do we do to resolve that? I was also curious that one of the things that popped out was, they wanted more disaggregation. Did you have a sense of what factors? I mean, are they looking for disaggregation, for example, gender, age, children with disabilities? Did you do some more digging around as to what it was that they wanted? Thanks.
Great. Gentleman up here.
Hi, I'm Fred Altman. I'm just wondering, is the data that people want uniform across all populations, particularly with respect to how much money the country spends on education?
And then Dion.
Hi, Dion Filmer from the World Bank. I'm just curious about who these respondents are in these two surveys. I think it'd be just useful to have a sense of, are they ministers, are they technocrats, or who are they in this in the administration?
Why don't you take those?
Then we can take those, yeah. So just as a quick recap of the questions on the floor, and Beth is going to help me with answering these things. So accuracy of data, what exactly do we mean by this? Are there particular deficiencies that people are trying to get at? The question over here about are there differences in low versus middle income countries in terms of how they view the data needs? And then this challenge of creating incentives to use data, are there particular strategies that would be useful or effective? There was a question on the fact that government actors feel like they need more data. Are there some practical strategies that could be in play to help resolve that problem of access for government actors specifically? And then also this question of, well, what type of disaggregated data are they looking for? And then also this question about, are we talking about people as a monolithic block, or do people vary in terms of the types of data that they're interested in? And then who are these stakeholders that you speak of in this sampling frame, who actually responded to the survey? Beth, any of those questions you wanted to take a stab at?
I think you should go ahead
Okay.
first.
Okay.
AidData.
All right. Excellent. All right. So accuracy of the data, I mean, this can mean a bunch of different constraints that commonly come up. And I'm kind of taking a step back here and reflecting more broadly on several research studies that we've done, both using key informant interviews in countries as well as in the governance sector, the education sector, elsewhere. So accuracy, there's a couple of common constraints. One that's notable is the fact that a lot of records, particularly at the point of service delivery, so it could be local schools or clinics, are actually collected in paper. And so that process of converting, the manual process of digitizing these records is ripe for, you thought you saw one number, you reported it differently, not through any avarice or intention on your own, just the mere process of converting this information. Some of it could be to the design of the tools that you're using to collect the data. Also the training of the people that are doing this work in practice. So when we talk about this basket of issues around accuracy, it's more focused on there's technical deficiencies either in how the data was collected or how it was stored, managed, and processed. And I think it varies depending upon the particular country. In terms of the incentives to use data and increasing those incentives, one of the common observations, and a colleague of mine from Development Gateway who did a related study framed it really well, and they said that the most common response from government officials is that using data is an overtime activity. And I thought that was a really nice way to sum it up, that there's no perceived benefit of me having a strong evidence base to support a decision that I made. And so when you talk about perverse incentives, you're thinking about the costs that I have to put into play to find data, to analyze it, to try to make some meaningful assessment on the basis of that. So there's a lot of costs for some uncertain future return. And so when you're talking about getting the incentives right for government stakeholders or others to use data, you're thinking about how do you reduce some of those costs and increase the benefits. And so there's some countries or some sectors where there's some really interesting work being done around performance-based bonuses. It's been done before in transparency. It could be done when it comes to effective use of evidence in decision-making. I think that could be a really interesting one. There's certainly a whole host of these things. It could be factored more into annual reviews for people and compensation. It could be another interesting option I've seen is giving access to professional development perks like exchange programs and whatnot for effective demonstration of results. On the disaggregation question, this can mean a bunch of different things depending on who you're talking to. And I think it's important to say that the one potential bias or skew from this particular study and the survey sample that we have is that we're primarily talking to national level leaders, so that are often based in the capital city. They have a broad purview of interest. If you go lower down to local government units or local community-based organizations, I think that actually you'd see this demand for disaggregation even higher or more pronounced than it is at the national level. It comes out a little bit. We've seen it in terms of certain types of vulnerable groups. I've never seen it to the specificity of like persons with disabilities or looking at gender, but vulnerability, given the mandate of the SDGs, is certainly up there. And then some interest in disaggregation and in trying to say how do you create a race to the top at the subnational level, and monitoring performance between districts and municipalities. Let's see. The stakeholders in the survey. So as I mentioned, it's primarily focused on national level leaders. There are 5 stakeholder groups that we draw from. So the first is government officials, and this includes, we particularly target mid and high level government officials. So we see a range of this. We've had former heads of state respond to the survey. We've also had people in the chief executive's office. We've had people at the head of ministry or like sub-ministry level. But then we also have people that are working a little bit closer to the ground. So there's a nice range there. We've done some discrete analysis before to look at whether there's differences in perceptions based on seniority or the type of position that people held. And we look at this both for the central agencies as well as the line ministries. Civil society organization leaders are another critical, important part. So these are domestic civil society organizations, the leaders of those groups, private sector leaders, independent experts are think tank representatives, academia on the ground, and then the local representatives of development partners, so the local USAID embassy representatives. And I would say that if you look across the sample, we have the best representation from government officials, and then followed by civil society, development partners. Our private sector sample is a little bit smaller. I'm happy to go into more detail afterwards, too. Beth, I'm going to give you a moment because I'm running out of breath.
Well, I think that
You want to come up here? That's fine. Why don't you hand it up?
so it's a quick it's a very quick note. It would seem like we've covered the ground with respect to this these questions. I think we in all humility we think that there's more to be done to understand this, what we can do, how we can improve. All right, how we can improve the use of data, and the sample is not huge, so that's one reason why we don't actually do a lot of disaggregation by type of respondent. So there's more work that can be done, and so I think we even though we're interpreting certainly what we have on hand, we invite you actually to help us think more about this question, about different kinds of stakeholders. I don't think we've really looked very much about, for example, some of the think tank stakeholders, those who are researchers, those who are in the private sector, as Sam was saying. So there's more work to be done on these questions, and we invite you to actually think about those, and we're happy to share with you what we've done, so that you can, in fact, extend what we have done to try to understand how the institutional context, how important that is in making sure that the data is used. So I think that's really just a caveat to say that we've made a good try to understand this. As I said earlier, it was very difficult to actually find research that really breaks down in the developing country context the different factors, the different obstacles to data use.
Which one is it, Sam? Pardon? It's this one right here. Yeah. So we figured out the mics, the situation. We only have a couple of minutes left, but I'll just briefly tack on to that to say, I think Beth would agree, would be the first to say that, the objective of this wasn't necessarily to capture the largest possible sample or to have the definitive piece on, we've solved all of the education data use questions in one fell swoop. But I think what we wanted to do, so a lot of us in different forums have done kind of more ad hoc or anecdotal case study work where you're doing deep dives with a particular set of stakeholders or you're looking at particular decisions or countries. And I think the value of this survey is to cast a wider net to say, okay, are some of the themes, are some of the trends that we're seeing in the particular people that we work with, or that you work with in the context of your work, is that kind of more broadly seen, and is there a more systematic way to really ask people and to get at the nut of, I think the question was raised about, well, if you ask people, do you want data or do you use data? It's easy to say yes, it's costless to say yes. But if you can kind of force them through additional questions to dig a little deeper, to tie it to particular things that they're working on, to give examples, to kind of get more specific, that's the hope. And now, the ask of you all is to test this out in practice, if you're a data producer, think about, how well are you doing in making sure that your existing data is fit for purpose? If you're a funder of data, how are you doing in terms of investing in the areas that there is revealed demand for this? If you are a user of data or an intermediary or somebody who's building capacity, we've scratched the surface a little bit on some of the stumbling blocks, but, what are some real solutions that we could look at to address those things? Yes, question over here.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Irene Gouleto with the United States Agency for International Development. I have a question for Dr. King. How do we create a culture of appreciation of data? Because in my mind, this is the deeper underlying of people appreciating and actually using data. What are some of the things we can do at the country level to help create a culture of appreciation of data?
Thank you very much for the great presentation. My name is Diana. I'm a scholar at the Wilson Center, and I also work in Africa, in Kenya to be specific. And first, I wanted to make a comment about that your presentation really resonated with some of the work we do back in Kenya, and especially on how to build a culture of evidence use. So specifically, we've been sort of working at institutional level to provide guidelines for evidence use. And we've also sort of worked to create caucuses in the parliaments in Kenya and Malawi to champion the evidence, the use of evidence at that top level, and at individual level to train mid and top level policymakers on using evidence. So it's still a learning process for us on what are the barriers to achieving success using those mechanisms, and perhaps we can get more perspectives from the group on how to push the culture forward. Then now my question was, I don't know if in your study, in your survey, you were able to look at circumstances where, so the evidence or data actually gets into the policy-making context, but then it doesn't translate into programs or action due to other barriers such as controversies, such as the comprehensive sexuality education in Kenya. I'll give an example. It had recommendations on having some action by the Ministry of Education, but then when time came to actually have a new curriculum in 2015, it sort of sidestepped the recommendations from the Ministry of Health. So I don't know how you've looked at institutional collaborations and the barriers at that level. Thank you.
Oops, sorry, one more. Thank you.
Thank you. It's Rebecca Ward from IREX. I work on a number of international development education programs. You've spoken a little bit about data culture and the use of performance-based incentives and things like that to incentivize this kind of culture. But I'm interested to know if you've explored that at the level of schools and educational institutions themselves, specifically looking at teachers and faculty, because we found that from their perspective, there's often quite a lot of pushback because perhaps they've flown under the radar. They might think that policymakers are asking the wrong questions, and they find it very stressful suddenly to be subject to all of these measurements. So if you have any insights on effectively dealing with that problem, I'm interested to hear them.
Great question. So just a quick recap of the three, and then we'll briefly, succinctly respond. So the last one is specifically on the data culture thread, but looking at this at a more at the last mile of service delivery, teachers, principals. How do you work with them that they embrace a data culture? The second question is kind of related, but more at a macro level on institutional collaboration. I think between, if I'm correctly saying this, between policymakers and practitioners that are working at different stages of service delivery. So, it's great to use evidence in the policy formulation, but if it doesn't carry through to actual implementation, monitoring, evaluation throughout the whole cycle, things break down. And so how do you deal with that? And then the first big question directed to Beth specifically is, you talk about building this culture of data and valuing data. How do we actually do this in practice? So maybe I'll let Beth answer all of this. No, I'll let Beth go first, and then I'll add a little bit.
Those are actually the hardest questions. How to build a culture for data use. My take on this is that I think by accumulating the evidence that there are benefits from actually collecting data and using data, I think I can't think of any other systematic way of building the culture other than adding the experience that data counts, that data actually confers benefits, data use confers benefits. And one example I have, two examples I have. One is, I remember an education specialist, I think who's no longer around, and his favorite topic was trying to help countries, trying to help the ministry deploy teachers to where they're wanted. And he color-coded schools, color-coded districts, and using the color coding to deploy, which actually corresponded to specific characteristics of districts, and then use that to be able to systematically deploy teachers across. I don't know if any of you know, I think his name was Tony Somerset. Anybody know him? I don't think he's with us, but that was one of the things that he was trying to illustrate, how having some kind of a system that's not whimsical and just that's based on actual data of teachers in specific school districts could help countries deploy teachers rationally. And then another example is, how do we reduce corruption in the distribution of textbooks? One problem that education systems have had to deal with, and using really data at all levels of the education system, monitoring the distribution at every node of distribution, and using that to eventually reveal where the corruption was at each stage, and putting all of that in the newspapers. So it's for me, it's collecting a lot of these various examples of how, without the data, the corruption would have, been going on, and the distribution of textbooks would not have happened. Without this color coding based on the actual number of teachers who show up, who are not just sort of, jackets on the backs of the chairs, but really places where there are actual teachers who show up. It's another example of showing parents, for example, that their children actually have teachers. Another example related to that, by the way, is something that Dion Filmer and his colleagues at the World Bank did using a survey of providers and surveys of teachers in classrooms, unannounced visits, because teacher attendance is very difficult to get, and unannounced visits, plus a nice, clever way, and you can ask Dion about that later, clever way to try to find out whether teachers actually know more than the students. Right? So there are different ways, and each time it's if we get the information out, and also then get a discourse among the stakeholders, such as parents who are very interested in children, in their own children. So using these various kinds of accumulating evidence in education can help show the importance of evidence, and hopefully that changes the culture either at the top or at the bottom of the system.
I think we're at time and we need to make time for our wonderful panelists, but let me just briefly say that on at the service delivery level, I think there's two sets of incentives that we need to speak to in terms of data culture. One is incentivizing teachers and officials to take data collection seriously. And I think the main challenge for that is that it's a black box. So they get these requests for data, forms to fill out, databases to submit and to upload, but they don't know, where this information is going, what decisions are made, how, what are the stakes? Like if I do a poor job in collecting this information, how bad is it? Do people really care? And so I think opening the black box of how this information is made and what the stakes are for, poor data collection is one piece. And then I think you partly answered the question yourself with the second, in terms of the second thing, which is, how often are these local level service delivery representatives, they're being asked to collect data for others, but they're not being asked what data would be most useful for you. And so that could also be a really, a very obvious incentive that you could do, is to say, well, let's design data collection systems that are really also speaking to the things that you care about. And I think that also ties into the institutional level question that was asked as well, but I'm happy to talk about that offline at the end of this. Thank you so much.